All right, class. I couldn't be there today with you guys. I'm at a conference, but I wanted to give you a quick summary of the Spanish-American War no matter what. So here it goes. So let's start in New York City, which is a strange place to start for this, given it's a war that was declared by Washington against Cuba, but that's because the media is a major cause of this war, in particular a concept called yellow journalism, whereby the media exaggerates what was going on. And in particular, William Randolph Hearst, who was in charge of the New York Journal, said to one of his photographers who was down in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." And whether or not he said these exact words, point is they were exaggerating what was going on, and that's going to be one of the major causes. Another is this. What's happening down in Cuba is ugly, and that's why the yellow journalism exists. And it's ugly because a man named Jose Marti, who's the leader of the sort of Cuban movement, nationalist movement against the Spanish, has a go with the Spanish governor, who is a military man named Valeriano Weyler, or he becomes known as Butcher Weyler, because of his tactics to suppress Cuban nationalism. So Martí tries to raise sort of a nationalist uprising to overthrow the Spanish, but he's not very successful. He doesn't get this what he wants, so it's more like guerrilla warfare than it is sort of nationalist uprising. So what he does, which is very bright, is he starts attacking American businesses to try to get the Americans involved, thinking they might expel the Spanish from Cuba. And America really gets involved partly because of the yellow journalists and their coverage of Weyler's policies. And this was his policy that was so unpopular, which was reconcentration. And so what happened is he basically rerouted the Cuban population into concentration camps or internment camps. And as you can see, a third of the Cuban population were moved to these camps, and over 200,000 died. So between that policy, the death, and the fighting between them, the fact that American businesses were getting attacked, and because of the yellow journalists back in the United States exaggerating this, these are all reasons that America gets very interested in this and starts to act. And one of the ways they act is they send the battleship down to Havana Harbor. The ship that's there, the USS Maine, actually sinks in Havana Harbor. Now, immediately, the yellow journalism of the U.S. starts to say that this was from a Cuban mine, and therefore a Spanish mine, and the Spanish had sunk an American ship, and that was a reason to go to war. Years later, we still debate what it actually was, but historians are saying it was probably a munitions explosion or some kind of mistake within the Maine rather than it being an overt act by the Spanish. But that, of course, didn't matter to the yellow journalists or to the Americans who start to get very angry about this. So, of course, that is a reason for war, but combine that with this, the fact that we intercepted a telegram going from the Spanish minister to Washington back to Spain that referred to McKinley as a weak, catering to the catering to the rabble, and a low politician. So, really calling him out for being weak. That doesn't really sit well with McKinley or America. And it's between that and the sinking of the Maine, Congress acts. And they declare war on Spain, April 25th of 1898, pretty easily if you look at the numbers. So we talk about two battles. One is this one. The Rough Riders, led by Colonel Roosevelt, took San Juan Hill in a big battle in Cuba, which was, as I wrote here, one of the few big battles and one of Teddy Roosevelt's favorite days of his life. Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he resigned this position to become Colonel Roosevelt in charge of the Rough Riders, which was a ragtag group of college athletes, Native Americans, cowboys, about as ragtag as you can get. And this was one big battle of the war that they won. Roosevelt also, when he was still Under Secretary of the Navy before he resigned, ordered Admiral Dewey, who was in charge of the Navy, to take Manila, which is the bay in the Philippines, which is another Spanish colony. So America takes Cuba. America also takes the Philippines. This was a blowout, if you will. The American Navy fired their cannons 5 times back and forth from port to starboard, and by that time the Spanish ships were sunk or were scuttled in what was a very easy victory for Dewey, which makes him very popular in the same way that Teddy Roosevelt becomes very popular from his win at San Juan Hill. Dewey then, and this is where it gets really interesting, after this victory, has a meeting with the leader of the resistance movement in the Philippines. The Philippines were resisting the Spanish much like the Cubans were. This guy's name was Emilio Aguinaldo. And in this meeting on Dewey's flagship, they have a conversation where the U.S. is basically trying to get the Filipino rebels to resist the Spanish to make it easier for when the U.S. gets to the Philippines to defeat the Spanish in this war. I'm going to come back to that because we're going to break this promise to Emilio Aguinaldo, who right now is, whipping up support in the Philippines to defeat the Spanish. So in the end, when Spain finally surrenders, America wins this war. Secretary of State John Hay calls it, quote, a splendid little war because it only lasted a number of months. It was a resounding victory and very few people died. In fact, more people died of disease than they did from the war. And as a result, the Americans got Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So a lot of territory. And here's what they did with that territory. I'm going to talk about the Platt Amendment and what we did with Cuba in a second. One of the reasons we went to this war is because of what was going on down in Cuba, so we agreed we'd make it free and independent. But we're going to put some restrictions on that. We take Puerto Rico as an American territory. We take Guam as an American territory, which we still have to this day. And then we take control of the Philippines, where President McKinley isn't sure exactly what he wants to do with it. So he says, we're going to educate and Christianize them. And we'll see how that works in a second. First to Cuba. We passed the Platt Amendment down in Cuba, whereby we say Cuba can't make treaties with other nations without the United States approval. So how independent, how free is Cuba really? And as you can see, that's also in owning Cuba, American businesses go down there and buy up land and buy up the cash crop down there, which is sugar. And when the Cubans start to resist that, much like Jose Marti, who was resisting the Spanish in the first place, the U.S. military comes in and crushes it, much like how Valeriano Weyler was doing that, Butcher Weyler, back when Marti was resisting. So it looks very similar to the reason America got in war in the first place. We also found a part of Cuba that we really wanted called Guantanamo Bay, where we still have a detention center to this day. We leased this from the Cubans. And here's a little infographic on that you can check out later when you check out this Prezi. I'm going to keep moving to the Philippines, whereby we do the exact same thing that the Spanish were doing in Cuba and the Philippines, where we break our deal with Emilio Aguinaldo, or should I say Admiral Dewey's deal with Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the resistance in the Philippines, and go and brutally crush the rebellion that the Philippines start to get rid of American rule, which starts to look a lot like Spanish rule. In fact, America starts putting the Filipinos in internment camps, much like we saw, which was the Spanish policy. So how much better than the Spanish are the Americans really? Well, in the Philippines, with the Philippine War here that you're looking at, and with Cuba, with the intervention in Cuba, once Cuba started resisting American businesses, we look a lot like the oppressors that we tossed from these countries. And that was what I asked you to do in your homework. So before you share your homework with your partners, I also wanted to do a quick recap. This is Cuba and Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam, which you can't see because it's too small. But long story short, America gets a lot of territory in this war and acts a lot like the oppressors they kicked out. At the same time, it's a splendid little war. You make of it what you will. We'll discuss it when I get back to class. Have a great end of the period.